Schengen, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for showing up. It's good to see a number of people in the room here that I know quite well, and of course also quite a few new faces. I must say I am indeed new to the job, and I've therefore quickly developed sort of two stump speeches. One of them is for an external audience, and one is for an internal audience. The external audience, I explain more about the CGIAR. The internal one, I talk more about all the issues we still have to address. And for today, I wasn't totally sure. I think I have sort of a strange mixed audience here of internal people and a few maybe who are more from the outside. So I wanted to start off to help me sort of focus this, the next 30 minutes best, to ask if there are people in this room who aren't quite familiar with the CGIAR. All right, there are a few hands up, but very few. I mean, the other 98%, I think, knows the CGIAR quite well. The other question I have is whether you're also quite familiar with this whole process of CGIAR reform that Schengen started to talk about. Could you raise your hand if you're not quite familiar with the CGIAR reform? Yes, quite a few more hands. I'll try and therefore not shower you with acronyms and inside talk, but I think then there are also people, starting with Umalele, who have actually been involved in thinking about this reform for the CGIAR for a long time. She actually led one of the reviews 10 years ago, about now. That sort of was one of the sort of set of recommendations, one of those that Schengen referred to that have, in a way, you know, sort of been given to the CGIAR for almost 20 years, and that indeed for a while didn't really take hold. Then he said something I think I would agree with, that this reform, this time it's for real. Although he then undermined that by saying, but then they've been saying that for 20 years. So at the end of this 30 minutes, I hope to have convinced you that this time it is for real. And let me talk to you a little bit, because I'm really brand new, and there are people in the room here who've worked on this reform for years. So I would like to at least begin with saying how much has already been accomplished. And then, while I know that many here in the room are much bigger experts on this issue of the, you know, the central priority of food security in coming decades than I am, IFPRI has certainly been a leading voice trying to convince the world that food security should be back at the top of the agenda. But let me at least introduce to you sort of our general understanding of that and how that leads to a set of challenges that the CGIAR is getting ready for. And then ask the question, is the CGIAR ready for that challenge? Is the reform something that has helped? Or, well, I will discuss that clearly there is sort of last mile or final inch work that needs to be done, some of it quite urgently, and I'll take you through a few of our remaining priorities that I've headlined under performance management, which is a key issue, closely followed by partnerships, more effective partnerships, and then a few issues that are sort of cross-cutting issues that are of clear concern to us, but that haven't been captured in CRP. So I'll tell you a bit what's happening there as well. To begin with, when I came back to the CGIAR, so I'm not typical of many of my colleagues that I haven't spent my whole 30-year career in the CGIAR. Yes, I was with the CGIAR for 7 years, but most of the other 25 years, I didn't even work in agriculture, like with Google and Gates. I really focused more on health than agriculture. So I'm a bit of an outsider, I guess. And certainly 5 years ago when I left IMI, if anybody had asked me to make a bet on whether the centers would come together into a single organization and sign a constitution, and whether the funders would come together into a single fund, and whether these two sort of parties would sign a joint agreement on how they would work together, I wouldn't have put any money down. I probably would have been on the other side betting against that. So I do think it's quite an accomplishment that the centers have come together in a consortium, that the donors have come together, and moreover, that what I think was clearly needed, this whole quilt of some 3,000 projects that the centers were working on, is in the process of being reformed to a much tighter, much more focused agenda that centers are working on in a sort of cross-center way, really working on priorities rather than every center working on its own. getting rid of some of the overlap, building more on some of the synergies between IFPRI and other centers working on policy, for example, and that we now have a CRP portfolio that I would say at least has been constructed and has been approved, but is still very much in the sort of the initial stages of sort of being implemented. And the fact that Karen, who is leading one of them, has been appointed but is here ahead of actually taking on that position, I think is nicely symbolic for that as well. So I would say over the last few years there have been some major achievements in the reform, and people also tell me, look, the kind of reform that you're undertaking, CIRAD for instance, the representative of CIRAD in Washington sits here. One of my first lunches in my new place of where I work in Montpellier was with Henri Carcelade. He is now a board member, many of you know them. You might not know that in the past, in the 70s and 80s, he was involved in the reform of CIRAD. He said, did you know that? And I didn't. That CIRAD was constituted from 13 independent centers. And then they formed a consortium, and then they sort of came together more, and then they formed 7 departments, and eventually it became one organization. Took 20 years. Don't kid yourself, he says. 2 or 3 years is short. So when we speak to people in the CGIAR who are all sick and tired of the reform, like it has taken too long, let's get back to work and so on, it's also good to have that perspective that sort of major processes like this take time. So yes, there are definitely things that are left undone, the last mile, and they are critical for us to sort of reap the benefits of the reform. But I would say, from my perspective, the people who have worked on the reform have sort of put the tools in the toolbox. The basic infrastructure is there to try and put this now together and make sure it really works. And in that, I must say, in the first few weeks of my tenure, it's like about 2 months now, Schengen, and this is the 6th center that I'm visiting. I just came from IITA in Nigeria, Benin, Africa Rice before that, CIAT in Colombia, CIP in Peru, CIMIT in Mexico. So I'm getting a quick tour, and I'm seeing what's happening at the centers. And I can see that this is an exciting time. Centers are growing, and they are engaged in this reform in a way that just is what Schengen said. He is committed to the reform, and that's what all my colleagues tell me as well. So back in a way to the story that Schengen also already introduced. I mean, in a way, agriculture is a victim of its own success. I mean, the Green Revolution, the abundant food, the low food prices have led to decades of neglect. I mean, the amount of money invested in agriculture diminished till it almost fell off the map. And you can see that in centers like the CGIAR, what flat budgets for 20 years will do to you. You can see it in many of the NARs, that many of them, with the exception of Embrapa and CARI and ICAR in China, with the exception of a few strong players that we now use as examples of, when you speak to Embrapa in Brazil, they're a success story. But then there are the other, I don't know, 100 failures. Or centers and NARs that are really in need of urgent investment. Now, the food price spikes of 2008, 2010, 2011 clearly have been a wake-up call and have helped put food security back at the top of the agenda. And indeed, right now, the drought you have here in this country in the Midwest, Ken Kasman, the chair of our Science Council, and others are saying we are having another likely serious situation this year. So yes, that may put a lot of people push people into poverty and food insecurity. It is at least a wake-up call for the world that food security ought to be back at the top of the agenda, and we are seeing that countries are beginning to invest. Now then, the challenge is, can we respond? I mean, you look at this picture, and initially you would say, well, there's actually this steady increase in yields, but this is Ken Kasman's slide. He then points out, that 64 kilos per hectare improvement, that was something like 3% in the 60s, and that has gradually gone down to something like 1%, and that's not enough. So we need more than that. And on top of that, it seems as if this line doesn't extrapolate, as if it's plateauing. Now, people are not necessarily all in agreement there. Ken Kasman and colleagues have some papers coming out. He is strongly convinced that this is what you can indeed see, which means when yield increases are stagnating and farmers now feel through these food price spikes the pressure to produce more, what do? Well, they're plowing under land. And according to Ken's analysis, they're plowing under land faster now than during the Green Revolution. So that is scary. That is why many environmental organizations that used to be sort of on the opposite side of the fence in Rio +20 have realized that actually agriculture and the environment are new best friends. If we don't have ecological intensification or sustainable intensification, the footprint of agriculture is going to be disastrous. So we have a real challenge to put yields up, even though this time around I think we are very aware that it has to be in a sustainable or ecological intensification way of doing that. Of course, the old argument is still that sort of transformation we think has to be driven by a science and technology-led innovation. Are we ready to provide that? Now, I'll hear just because many people, not in this room I think, would say, but isn't sort of the private sector providing that? So just the one slide of saying, look, yes, if you're a corn farmer in Nebraska, probably private sector research is serving your needs. If you're a small corn farmer somewhere in Africa, chances are the challenges facing that smallholder farmer are different. It's not the same diseases, it's not the same issues of access to market. So yes, the smallholder farmers are the traditional, well, maybe not as traditional. When Sirgeldin in the late 90s explained to me what the CGIAR was, it was betting on the better farmers and lifting them up and hoping that they would pull up the smallholders. Now there is much more explicit emphasis on smallholders and on rain-fed farming on the marginal areas and working with those. What will it take? Well, organizations like IFPRI have been showing us the sums, massively increased investment. Of course, not just in the CGIAR, not just in research. It might be investment in infrastructure, it will be different policies, and the kind of estimates we see are that as much as $20 billion per year more in Africa, maybe 7 billion of which would be public money, the rest from the private sector, meaning the majority. And indeed, as much as 90 or more percent not in research. But still, even for the CGIAR share in the public research agenda at an international scale, IFPRI's numbers were that the CGIAR needed to grow to about $1 billion at a time when it was about $400 million, and that it would have to go up to $1.6 billion. Not totally sure if the 2020 year is right. Schengen might be able to correct me on that. When I was typing that in this morning from memory, I wasn't sure if it was 2020 or 2025. But in any case, these scenarios were based on trying to add 0.5% per year in yield growth on top of what we are currently seeing. But then now in a more holistic approach. So yes, certainly there is a life science revolution out there. You go to any of the centers and, what was just a dream 5-6 years ago, marker-assisted selection, things like that, basically molecular biology, it's absolutely everywhere now. So that is a very rapid change in science in the last 5-6 years, that where it has, if you like, reached and changed and transformed the medical sciences, has just begun to change agriculture. So we do expect that there will be a lot more basic changes in science in the next 10-20 years. But we're very aware now, more than before, that the CGIAR is funded out of the development budget, not the National Science Foundation, and our donors are very clear that what we are delivering is development outcomes. So we might not be as experienced in setting those results in a way that we understand what it is that we are being held accountable for and what our partners need to do, but it's definitely part of our charge, if you like. And clearly, and I'm not just adding this because we're here in IFPRI, we are very aware that it's not just improving germplasm and getting it to farmers. that needs to happen in a context of access to markets, supply chains that work, policy context that work, post-harvest losses that are cut, and all that. Is the CGIAR ready to deliver against those challenges? Well, there is now a single SRF, which stands for Strategy. Is it Strategy Results Framework? That sounds funny. We usually say SRF. It is our strategy. As a strategy, it's quite okay. Results, it doesn't quite specify. We've gone through a few cycles of the SRF. IFPRI, Joachim von Braun, developed one that was highly modeled and very metric-based, and people said that's too theoretical, don't want that. The current one has been approved, but we recognize it is the pendulum swung rather far back to the other side, and there are almost no numbers in it. So the pendulum will have to swing halfway back, hopefully, and that is an exercise that we are currently involved in, saying how can we add metrics, if you like, provide prioritization, and have a much better idea of what it is that the results are that we can deliver in this system, which indeed, here it sketches out how the 15-odd research programs, where they are active, and then we don't have special research programs for gender or capacity strengthening or partners, but that certainly are cross-cutting issues that will have to be very clearly and strongly developed throughout this portfolio against the kind of system-wide outcomes that Schengen already mentioned. I won't take you too long to this, but there was a whole basis behind this reform where people said, look, while the CGIAR has a glorious past and people involved in that have a good reason to be proud of that, it had gradually sort of, what word shall I use, deteriorated to a system that, through mission creep and funding pressures was a bit tired. So this is meant to be a pretty solid freshening up of that system that has a much clearer visions, centers that work across their institutional boundaries, streamlined and effective governance, and clear partnerships with the outside that deliver, so that we can be held accountable for development outcomes. Sort of interesting, particularly for people like Monty Udelman, who sits here, who's been involved in, I think, most of that history over the last 40 years, to sort of see all these different stages. You could ask him or Uma there more about this whole background, but it's good to see sort of that this is in a way sort of a step in a very much longer process. Before I show you this pretty picture of where we are now and what we are focusing on, and then really starting to say, well, so what is remaining? We have a fairly complex organization now, but one that I believe may work together quite well. There are the partners and the stakeholders that we have to find a good way to link with. I would say that that is one of the promises of the reform that we have not quite fulfilled. So there's some major homework there. There's the consortium and its 15 members that are clearly working together more now. I mean, I meet scientists in centers, in SIP or in CIAT that say, I've worked more with other centers the last year than in the 10 years before that. Ongoing process, but definitely changing. An independent evaluation arrangement that is still being set up, although the director has now been hired. The fund, here in Washington at the bank, quite a different way how the donors work together. And in a way, the old TAC going through new names and pretty much a very similar charge for what they are doing, still based in Rome at FAO. And a pretty picture of how this is all supposed to work together. And let me just say, it says partnership everywhere there, which is at least the intent that is important. I'll move on from that and say, let me give you some of the good news to end with before I go to some of the homework or the further improvements that we need to focus on. So the donors have set up this fund, the CGIAR Fund, and this was its first year of operations. In that first year is the most important message that I'd like to give you. I think a fairly amazing $400 million was put into this fund by the different donors. Window one, I won't need to bore you with all of that too much. Window 1 is sort of the most unrestricted window where the consortium and the group of donors can decide how that is best invested. Window 2, the donors tell us exactly which of the CRPs, which of the research programs they want to have this invested in. Window 3, as it is de facto, are projects that are supposed to support the CRPs, but they're basically bilateral projects that are negotiated with the centers separately. And there are quite a few organizations that are committed now, that have signed agreements with the World Bank to be contributors, and a somewhat amazing amount of $400 million, a bit more than that, was received in May of this year. The good news. Comparing that to what IFPRI's forecasts were of what it takes, so that almost incredible, you know, the hockey stick thing of where IFPRI said it's been flat for decades, it really needs to go there. Surprisingly to me, it seems that that is actually happening more than we expected. So this year, the centers and fund office forecast is that the collective contribution from the donors, the expenditures of the centers, will be at the $850 million level, up from 400 just a few years ago. I find that quite surprising, and you can see it everywhere you go. You go to CIMMIT and it's a construction site. They're rebuilding their labs everywhere. You go to SIP and they're growing 35% this year. You go to Africa Rice and they're expanding their labs, they're expanding their fields, they're growing vigorously. You go to IITA and they're saying they're growing 40% this year. So it is not just here on the fund office slide, it's actually translating into activity on the ground, as concrete as, you know, construction sites. And of course, IFPRI, I said, I don't know, you know, they are right in there. By adding a floor here, we are in a construction site here too, isn't it, Schengen? So yes, the centers are expanding vigorously. You can see that there is a new energy in the whole system that I think is good. There's still a gap, but we'll see how that turns out. Another bit of good news is that the investors have all been complaining that the overheads of the system were too high, and there is a pretty concerted effort to bring those down, from as high as 24% in about 8 years ago to about 16% last year, with a goal to bring that down to 15% total, 13 for centers and 2 for system costs. And that is partly, of course, centers being forced to operate more like a business and charging more of their lab costs and others directly back to research. Partly it is really centers turning over pennies and becoming more efficient. And some of it is, as centers grow, because it's easier with a, you know, relatively fixed overhead to have a smaller overhead in a large center than it is in a small center. All right, if that's was the good news, if you like, that there is renewed interest in investment in response to at least those food price spikes, but I'm hoping also at least somewhat in response to this reform, then what are the last mile things that still have to happen? As I already said a bit, the strategy and results framework lacks metrics. There's no clear priority setting, and a lot of people are still quite worried about the high transaction cost. And in part, I would have to say that has very much to do with the next issue. If you look at the CRP portfolio, then you know that for very understandable reasons, many of them were constructed with what I would call a bit too much look in the rear view mirror. What were we all doing? You know, how do we protect our turf? How do we sort of construct these things from what there is now? So it's time to sort of turn that around and look ahead, and don't look just internally, but look outside and say, so what are the challenges? How do we link what the CRPs can deliver to the priorities from the CADEB, you know, the investment strategies that countries in Africa have? How do we build stronger partnerships to make this happen? And what are the results that we can really be held accountable for? And are we willing to stick our neck out for those results and say, this is what we will deliver, and take on more accountability, more risk for delivering those? And finally, I would say on partnerships, there's a strange contrast. I go from center to center, and more or less all of them tell me how good they are at partnerships and how many they have. But you go outside, and that's not a view shared by the partners. So there's a fairly big gap in perception between the center's own self-perception there and the outside partners. And my view is simple. I mean, in a way, we are a service industry, so the client is king. The partner's perception is what counts. The partner's perception is our reality. So we'll do another partnership survey, partnership perception survey, and understand better what it is that the rest of the world thinks about us. So remaining reform priorities, ones that I've put on the agenda but that the consortium board feels are important priorities, and that I think in discussion with my colleagues in the member centers have fairly clear agreement on, that absolutely the first priority is to continue to work on the CRP portfolio to make sure that it at least becomes a very attractive investment portfolio, one that indeed has clear outcomes linked to these system level outcomes and eventually impacts that we are working for, and clear value propositions, clear value from money, linked to good reporting, good monitoring, and clear impact assessment. Frankly, I think if we don't do that, we're dead. So that has to be the first priority. But the second one, quite closely following that, is that we have to fulfill this promise that we will work in a more open way with partners. I can't repeat this, but I think if we don't do that right, we're also not going to be successful. I can't repeat that we're dead, is what I was tempted to say. But those are both sort of, I think, must-haves in the language of the ISPC. How do we do that? Well, what I like to call the performance management system, and that is currently developed through the SRF action plan, which was a funders forum, mandated exercise that we have to submit to the funders by October. Through the SRF action plan, saying how will we improve the SRF, we're developing something that I call the performance management system that brings together a few priorities we already had, making sure we have metrics for the SLOs and the CRPs, a system for priority setting. What it didn't quite say was, and we would like to link that to money. I mean, the CGIAR traditionally has had sort of the programmatic pillar and the finance pillar. I think we need to bring them together. And in fact, when I was at the Gates Foundation, I experimented there at a fairly large scale, at least tens of millions of dollars, with something that I call outcome contracting, where we wrote grant agreements that didn't say you will deliver this and then we'll reimburse you for your expenditures. It said, you'll deliver this, and if you do, we'll pay you that. That means holding grantees accountable, but also giving them the freedom to spend that money in a way as they see fit to achieve the outcome. And that is also the grand bargain that I would like to have with the CGIAR and the donors. Yes, being held accountable for development outcomes, but being left to determine how best to achieve those, meaning more flexibility in how that is implemented in return. We'll have, I have one more slide on performance management before I close that. On partnerships, I don't have another slide. There's at least two things. We have to get more in touch with the perception of our partners of us, and we'll do another partnership perception survey. There was one done in 2006. We'll try and do another one this year. And there are also some very interesting efforts, one led by IFPRI. I'll get my first sort of in-depth tutorial this afternoon on the CGIAR CADAP mapping and alignment process. I think those are very real opportunities that IFPRI has been involved in for a long time, but not necessarily all the other centers and CRPs have grasped or prioritized as much as they could. Opportunities to really make sure that what we deliver is in line with the demands from countries and is sort of in lockstep with the other investments that are likely to be made and that we would need to make sure that the CGIAR can deliver outcomes that lead to impacts. And then there are a few cross-cutting issues that people are interested in, so I'll give you the elevator pitch on feedback there. Gender research, people say, why don't you have a CRP for that? Well, we have decided that it's too important. We can't hive it off and say, those people do gender research. No, all the CRPs need to pay attention to this issue. Now then, of course, you could be cynical and say, well, yeah, that sounds good, but is it going to happen? So we're in the middle of that. We have asked each of the CRPs to have gender strategies, and most of those will be approved before the end of the year. But then you could still say, well, are they going to do that? So that is what we are now discussing and saying, okay, fits with our ideas on performance. Why not have a performance fund, for instance, and ask each of the CRPs to show what it is in their program of work and budget next year that they will do to implement their gender strategy, what the separable activities and budgets are, and we'll use some of the carrots that we have within our funding availability to encourage that. On agrobiodiversity, the news is that many of the centers are working on that. In a way, the capacity is much higher. The coordination among centers and CRPs wasn't necessarily as high. So there we're having a workshop as we speak, in fact, these days, today through Thursday, of the CRPs to come together with a single approach of the CGIAR to agrobiodiversity conservation, particularly in situ, to complement the ex situ, the gene bank strategy that has been much better developed. And we'll see how we can make sure that that gets incorporated into the CRP portfolio as well. Finally, capacity strengthening is another area where the CGIAR traditionally has done quite a bit of work, but over the reform, it is an area where people say, look, why don't you have a strategy for that? And I would agree. I think there's a key area where the CGIAR can contribute and where we have to be very explicit. So we'll probably follow an approach like for gender and say each of the CRPs have to have a strategy of how they build capacity strengthening into the CRPs, and many do, in fact. And there might be some things that we could do better at the system level. I love the idea of a CGIAR postdoc program, for instance. I think that is a knife that cuts on many edges that really will bring young scientists to the system, provides a stepping stone for young scientists, will provide an opportunity to build partnerships. So those are things that for now are on my personal wish list, but that you'll hopefully see very soon. And finally, to make sure that that doesn't drop off the radar, we are, of course, deeply interested in efficiency. The donors wouldn't let us forget that. And we have, although it's in a way not as exciting, for instance, revived a working group on shared services. There are some very big projects in the works now. There's going to be a single OCS, a one corporate system that is a single finance system for many of the centers. Not so much IFPRI, because IFPRI is here in the US and has a few different laws to fit with here in the US, but most of the other centers are likely to have a single finance system. Boring, I know, but that means, for instance, that you'll have a shared chart of accounts, which means for a project manager, it becomes much easier to manage a project across research sites and research centers, for instance. Real back office integration that will lead to efficiencies on the one hand and improved, more effective science implementation on the other. I could talk about that for an hour, and I won't. So the ISPC, our Science and Partnership Council, has come out with, on our request, with a very nice white paper on priority setting. If you haven't read it yet and you're interested in this subject, you should. It sort of helps make sense of a lot of these terms that are floating around, from outputs to outcomes to intermediate development outcomes. And in discussion, we have agreed to be in favor of a two-level system of priority setting, which is a bit of a compromise between that former, if you like, IFPRI-led modeling framework and the completely narrative-based current SRF. Let's have, on the one hand, some targets, maybe more MDG-like, for what our ambition level is on the impacts, translate that into system-level intermediate development outcomes, groups of them probably, and ask the CRPs bottom-up to come up with their intermediate development outcomes and try and match these in a negotiated situation. After all, this is more a political, managerial process than just science. And also ask the CRPs to come up with value propositions. This has to be linked to, okay, you can do this, but what does it cost? And while we won't be able to assess, we think, the rate of return or the return on investment for each of these, at the very least we can talk about value for money, and we can compare that across groups of comparable activities. And indeed, if we build that sort of basic infrastructure that I'm sketching here, then we think we should be able to change the way we are funding from one where we are basically reimbursing expenditures to one where we are paying for performance. Now I'll let that hang for a moment. We could talk about that for an hour or two, and I'm sure I will with my colleagues before we are done with all that. So the timeline, this is almost done now. I'm just sharing with you that not all of this is going to happen instantly. We have a very big milestone in October of this year where there is a group of meetings, the GCARD, the Global Forum on Agricultural Research's biannual meeting, where we meet with our partners and outside stakeholders. There we have the SRF action plan on the table. There we also have the design of our performance management system on the table. And we think a much better set of outcomes for the CRPs than are in the CRP proposals, because when I speak to CRP leaders, often they have a much better sense of a small set of outcomes that they could really deliver than that 50 set of outcomes that are in their proposals. So I think we could actually do ourselves a favor and come up with a much better set of outcomes based on what we already have before we even start improving those. So presuming in October we get reasonable agreement on what to do, the homework would be to try and get this system in place before we have to prepare our 2014 budget in sort of Washington financial cycle speak. We also have a cycle like that. Our budgets are approved in October. That means by sort of the middle of the year, we have to get ready to think about the next financial cycle. So we'd have to have most of this stuff ready to be practical of influence for the 2014 budget. And that is meant to be reassuring to all those that thought that I wanted to have all this ready for the 2013 budget. It is a hasty path for all those that think that this is going to take many more years. So it's a compromise. Last slide. I do think that the reform to date is already a pretty major accomplishment. Just in time, before everybody gave up on the CGIAR pulled its socks up, I would say. And I do think we are a lot more ready now than we were a few years ago to meet these renewed challenges in the food security area. We are seeing a lot of growth in centers. You know, you go there, they're not, you know, places where people are all moaning and complaining. They're places where people are building and constructing and looking forward and working on new science. That isn't quite as integrated as we'd like it to see, but the CRPs are beginning to make a difference in the way we work. Very much of what we are talking about is a cultural change, which will definitely take more time than we've had so far to really accomplish. So we know that we have pretty urgent work to do, last mile stuff, to really make sure that we realize the benefits of the reform, to really deliver impact against these system level objectives. But you know, disagreeing with the people who gave me their condolences when I took this job and say you have an impossible job, I actually think it can be done. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.